Consider this seemingly straightforward statement. God will not be merciful to those who are not merciful to mankind. Islam's most important prophet, Muhammad, is said to have expressed this sentiment. But how do we know whether or not he actually said the words? Well, for some it's a matter of faith, which requires no evidentiary proof. For others, the fact that the words were written down by a man named Imam al-Bukhari is all the verification of its authenticity that they need. The Arabic word for the sayings of Muhammad is hadith, and the hadith, or sayings of the Prophet, are one principal subject of this lecture. But so is Imam al-Bukhari, the man responsible for the first great collection of his hadith. Al-Bukhari compiled his book during the Islamic Golden Age, from roughly 750 to 1258 AD. And while the age encompasses the Muslim world's vast contributions to the arts, to the sciences, and to government and empire building, of all the subjects we might consider when talking about the Islamic Golden Age, the story of the collection of hadiths focuses most closely on the religion of Islam itself. Indeed, the focus of this lecture is a vitally important matter in Islamic theology. At the most basic level, hadith are the sayings and actions of Muhammad, and so they provide guidance as to how a Muslim should properly lead his or her life. Over time, it was through various collections of hadith that Islam became more formally codified, more structured, and more dogmatic. One demonstration of this can be found in the fissure of the two main branches of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia. Today, they have different hadith traditions, which also started during the Golden Age. The overwhelming majority of Islamic scholars, both living and dead, view Imam al-Bukhari's book of Muhammad's collected sayings as the most authentic and therefore the most important literature in the Islamic faith after Islam's most sacred text, the Quran itself. Akin to the Bible for Christians or the Torah and other sacred texts for Jews, the Quran is held by Orthodox Muslims to have been revealed by God to Muhammad. But the text itself is believed eternal, meaning it predated the revelation. Many early Muslims believed the Quran held all the answers, but in time, more and more Muslims felt the need for some additional guidance, especially in matters of daily life. In this way, what Muhammad said and what he did was adopted as an example of the best way to live and behave. So accounts of what Muhammad said and did in his own lifetime were passed on through a chain of transmitters from one generation to the next and the one after that, and so on. So while examining Bukhari's labours in compiling more than 7,000 hadith, we will also consider the process of authenticating these sayings, because authentication is a central component of the work of all hadith compilers. It's important to understand that each hadith consists of two parts. One, the words themselves, which present Muhammad's words or actions. And two, the chain of transmission I just mentioned. That is, how the words were passed down from Muhammad's day up to the point where they were written down as hadith. Now we have to ask ourselves this. Why, if the hadith were so important, weren't they collected and written down until the start of the 9th century, i.e., 200 years after Muhammad's death? According to Muslim tradition, one reason Muhammad's sayings weren't written down while he was alive is because he was worried that people might confuse his words as belonging to the Quran. However, by al-Bukhari's day, tens of thousands of sayings were being attributed to Muhammad, and it was believed that many of these were false, forgeries and inventions. One could write an endless list of reasons why people would want to make up the sayings of Muhammad, but in most cases, it comes down to a simple matter of influence or power. So, for example, if you were having a dispute with your neighbour, you might go and see a sympathetic sheikh and ask for his advice. This man might lend you his support by saying, well, Muhammad once said that your family was noble and good and brave, and that you have the right to marry any girl you choose. And so you'd go with the sheikh and play the trump card with your rival. Muhammad said so. Now, this might seem like a frivolous example, but as I say, there were tens of thousands of similar examples flying about at this time. And if one believes the tradition, Muhammad saw the potential problem lying ahead. There is even a hadith attributed to him in which he said, "There will be forgers, liars who will bring you hadith which neither you nor your forefathers have heard. Beware of them, that they may not lead you astray." And so, the Muslim faithful decided that something had to be done about the proliferation of false hadith. It was time to separate the wheat from the chaff, the true sayings from the false. But how could this be reliably done more than 200 years after Muhammad's death? And who would take on the task? Well, as we now know, the man to take the task on would be none other than Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. Born in 809 or 810 in the city of Bukhara in modern-day Uzbekistan, Bukhari was the first man to take on the task of compiling and authenticating a hadith collection. And in part, because his was the very first collection of hadith, it's still seen as the most important and most authentic, at least in Sunni Islam. This is an important distinction to make because, as I've indicated, Shia Islam has its own view of what constitutes authentic hadith and which hadith collectors are to be trusted. But I'll return to that subject later. Al-Bukhari's birthplace in the ancient Persian city of Bukhara is one of the most important locations on the ancient Silk Road, that network of trade routes that had, since around 100 BC, connected China and its export of silk with India, Central Asia, Persia, Arabia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Although the Muslim-Arab invasion of Persia started in 633, the year after Muhammad's death, the city was still only on the very fringes of the Muslim world by al-Bukhari's time, nearly 2 centuries later. Interestingly, and perhaps significantly, most great compilers of the hadith came from the fringes of the Caliphate or Islamic Empire. Perhaps their remoteness from Islam's religious center in Mecca and its political capital in Baghdad made them feel compelled to assert their place in the faith. Or perhaps it was more important to codify the faith at its margins. In either event, they did this through Islamic scholarship that hadn't previously been cornered by Arab scholars. Al-Bukhari's father died when he was an infant, but it seems the child was a precocious one, whose natural intelligence was spotted young. It's said that he started studying the hadith at the age of 10 and was quickly able to challenge the opinions of older, respected Muslim scholars. A turning point in his life came when he was in his late teens and he made his pilgrimage, or Hajj, to Mecca, along with his mother, brother, and other family members. Once having performed the Hajj, al-Bukhari decided to stay in Mecca and continue his hadith studies there, now no doubt excited by being in the religious heart of Islam. Naturally enough, Mecca attracted learned men from across the Islamic world, allowing this youth to hear every possible opinion and school of thought then present in the Muslim faith. After some time, however, al-Bukhari decided that meeting just those who made the pilgrimage to the city wasn't a thorough enough approach for his studies, and so he started traveling throughout the Muslim world. For the next 16 years, he journeyed throughout the Arabian Peninsula, which covers modern Yemen, Oman, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, as well as southern Iraq and Jordan, and he went further to Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and his Persian homeland. Everywhere he went, he interviewed every scholar he could, amassing the widest collection of Muhammad's sayings that anyone had ever previously attempted to assemble. During these 16 years on the road, al-Bukhari is said to have interviewed 1,080 leading Muslim scholars. Between them, these men provided him something in the order of 600,000 hadith for his collection. Now, we should say that the book al-Bukhari eventually produced didn't include anything like that number. Instead, he selected about 7,500 hadith that he considered genuine. Now, there are a couple of things we need to elaborate on here. One, that astonishing total number of hadith he's said to have collected, and two, how he decided which were authentic and which were not. To start with, the figure of 600,000 hadith that al-Bukhari collected on his travels deserves some clarification. Each time a hadith is repeated or passed down to another transmitter, the recitation by the transmitter is also counted towards the total number of hadith. So, if it's true that al-Bukhari met with 1,080 scholars during his travels, and speaking hypothetically, each of them provided him with 100 hadith, then the total number of sayings would be 108,000. Now, let's assume that in the 200 years between Muhammad uttering the original words and the time of al-Bukhari's day, there were an average of 6 transmitters, or links, in the chain. Suddenly, the 108,000 original hadith adds up to almost 650,000. Thus, what initially sounds like an impossible number can quickly be reduced to a much more realistic figure. So, once al-Bukhari eliminated those hadith that were duplicates, identical to one another in every respect, the total number could be reduced even further. Still, authenticity undoubtedly remains a central question in the matter of hadith studies, and at the very heart of the subject matter. To frame our thinking about this question, let's return to al-Bukhari's full name by way of an example. It provides a useful illustration of his job of compiling and authenticating hadith. Although he is generally known today simply as Imam al-Bukhari, his full name was Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ishmael ibn Ibrahim ibn Mughari ibn Bardizbah al-Jufi al-Bukhari. Now, some of these are personal, proper names, while others tell us about where he comes from, both geographically and in terms of his lineage. For instance, the surname al-Bukhari refers to the fact that he comes from the Persian province of Bukhara. Several of his names, as is common in Arabic, also tell us whose son he was, and whose son his father was, and indeed who his grandfather was the son of. In this way, his family established a demonstrable line to their family tree. Or to put it another way, evidence of al-Bukhari's lineage through the generations. And this is precisely what al-Bukhari was doing when he compiled his lists of hadith. Another way we can think of this: what would you do if I stood here and told you, for instance, that Abraham Lincoln once said, "I like cheese"? You would, I hope, quite rightly challenge my claim and say, "Oh yeah, says who?" Well, I would then be forced to respond by saying, "Look, it's written here in this biography of Lincoln that's just come out." You would then press the issue by asking, "And where did that biographer get this quotation?" I might reply, "He says it's in a biography of Lincoln from the 1970s. And we could go together to find that book and the line that Lincoln reportedly uttered. and then ask ourselves, okay, but where did that biographer get the line? And so on and so forth. If we wanted to show that Lincoln actually said, "I like cheese," we'd repeat the process back and back until perhaps, if we were lucky, we got to a first-hand account of a dinner party where, when the cheese plate was passed around, Abraham Lincoln said, "Oh, yes please, I love cheese." And we could hope also that the person who was sitting there and claimed to have actually heard Lincoln say this was also a reliable and trustworthy individual. In just the same way, al-Bukhari and his fellow hadith collectors travelled the Muslim world, speaking to scholars who could provide demonstrable, unbroken and reliable lines of transmission for the utterances of Muhammad from his time to their own. Now, regarding President Lincoln, after writing about him and cheese, to make this point, of course, I had to look it up. I found the following line in several sources. It is said that his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, had a hard time getting him to remember to eat at all. But one of his favourite meals was fresh fruit and nuts, cheese and crackers. Now, note the use of "it is said." As Mrs. Lincoln never wrote a biography, we're relying on the statement about his love of cheese on reported speech. And that's exactly the same question al-Bukhari and his fellow hadith collectors had to address constantly. Every major religion has at its heart a principle known as the Golden Rule. Otherwise known as the law of reciprocity, the Golden Rule holds that you should treat others as you yourself would like to be treated. Whether Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism or Judaism, they all have some form of this Golden Rule. In Christianity, it's seen in Jesus' instruction to love thy neighbour as thyself. Islam's near equivalent is a saying by Muhammad, quote, "None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself." In Islam, as in Christianity and all the other religions I've just mentioned, believers and non-believers alike can, and indeed do, ask the question, how do I know that those words were actually spoken by that person? For many believers, it might be enough that it has been approved or sanctioned by their religious authorities, the priestly class, and by tradition. For others, this isn't enough, and they want proof, or as close to proof as it's possible to get. So that's what al-Bukhari was trying to do. But was he successful? Well, if you're a Muslim, you would probably think that he was, and that al-Bukhari's hadith collection is authentic. However, if you're from another religious tradition, or of no religion at all, you're probably going to see the hadith as fabricated at worst, or at best, impossible to know whether or not they are true. But regardless of one's opinion, what we need to understand now is the place in Islamic orthodoxy held by al-Bukhari's and other supposedly authentic collections of hadith. The full title of al-Bukhari's hadith collection is The Abridged Collection of Sound Reports with Chains of Narration going back all the way to the Prophet regarding matters pertaining to the Prophet, his practices and his times for Muslims. It's probably just as well that it's more typically referred to as Sahih al-Bukhari, or the authentic al-Bukhari. And it's a book that's very much supposed to be consulted. Consequently, to make reference easier, the approximately 7,500 hadith are arranged into roughly 90 broadly thematic chapters, covering a bewildering array of subjects, both religious and temporal. Here, one can find everything from Muhammad's ostensible opinion or revelations about the creation of the universe, to how and when and where to pray. It also covers such areas as marriage guidance, funeral arrangements, and what to do and not do while making the Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca. Also in this collection are rules for conducting so-called holy war, or the lesser jihad. The greater or more important jihad being the non-violent and never-ending struggle to be a better person. Alongside more obvious religious injunctions, the Hadith provide advice on manumitting, that is, freeing one's slaves. What to do if you find lost property, the importance of private property and good manners, restrictions on loans and repayments, and how to control one's temper. As al-Bukhari tells us, Muhammad said, "The strong man is not the good wrestler. Rather, the strong man is the one who controls himself when he is angry." As we think about the life and impact of the work of Imam al-Bukhari, the most important question about his collection of hadith, and the one I suppose we'll never have an entirely satisfactory answer, is the question of authenticity. Simply put, are these hadith what they claim to be? Are they Muhammad's authentic words or mode of behavior? For Western and mainly non-Muslim scholars, we find it impossible to say either way. So where does that leave us? Are the hadith true or not? They might be, and then again, they might not be. Al-Bukhari's collection certainly contains some hadith that hold more appeal than others, at least from the perspective of 21st century non-Muslims. Many express kindness, compassion, and love for others. Then again, any number of other sayings communicate a more violent message, including hadith that may be objectionable or simply wrong, not to mention those that come across perhaps as nonsensical. One can find numerous expressions of 7th century mores regarding gender discrimination, and a great deal more. And let's not forget those 200 years prior to the written record of the hadith. These are words that passed down through 5, 6, or 7 generations. Scholars, sheikhs, and ordinary men and women could, of course, select or choose hadith that suited their own opinion or purpose at any given time. So the difficulty in reading them today is that unless you are prepared to employ blind faith and accept every single word as literal truth, then there might be a great deal to object to. Of course, one could say the same about reading any number of other religious texts. Muhammad may have said some of the words and not others. Even those hadith that may be false aren't necessarily or deliberately fabricated. But then again, they might be. Now, if that answer appears pusillanimous or disappointing, what I can say without equivocation is that the majority of Western scholars, including some Muslim ones, retain a degree of skepticism regarding the veracity of claims about the hadith's absolute authenticity. To put it more plainly, the burden of evidence required to demonstrate that something is true beyond all reasonable doubt was far less rigorous in the 9th century, when al-Bukhari was travelling around the Middle East, than it would be in the modern era. Now, this isn't to criticise or defend al-Bukhari, but rather just to lay out the facts. Some might find an open-ended conclusion disappointing, but if we care about employing today's scholarly standards, there's not a great deal one can add at this time. It may go without saying that the same critique about proving the objective reality of words could just as easily be applied to words that may or may not have been recited by Jesus, the Old Testament prophets, and the Buddha. What we can discern with much greater certainty is the importance and impact that al-Bukhari and the other hadith collections considered to be authentic had for Islam down the centuries. The late historian of the Arab world, Professor Albert Hourani of St. Antony's College, Oxford, once wrote of the hadith, No less important than the question of their origins is that of the way in which they have been used. At moments of political tension, when the enemy was at the gates, the ruler might ask the religious scholars to read selections from Bukhari in the great mosque as a kind of assurance of what God had done for his people. Another important point about the hadith that remains relevant to Islam in the present day is the fact that Sunni and Shia Muslims continue to follow different hadith traditions. Why? Well, unlike many matters relating to religious differences, this question has a relatively easy answer. Sunni and Shia hadith collections differ because these two distinct branches don't agree about the reliability of the narrators or transmitters of the hadith. For example, there are those narrators who from the very beginning of Islamic history sided with the right of Abu Bakr and Umar to be the first and second caliphs or successors to Muhammad after his death. On the other hand, there were those who supported Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, as the rightful first caliph. Ali would become the fourth caliph following the death of Muhammad, but this leadership dispute remains at the heart of the enduring Sunni-Shia split. I'm going to end here with an observation that I find of interest because it gets to the heart of the problem inherent in so many questions about religious authenticity and otherwise. And it's this. Hadith critics and hadith rejectors, as they're sometimes called, exist not only outside of Islam, but within the faith itself. Believing that the Quran alone is sufficient, these Muslim Quranists, as they're also known, show complete disregard for any text beyond or outside of Islam's central statement of faith, including the hadith that came afterward. One prominent hadith rejecter during the Golden Age was the Arabic author Al-Jahiz. One of the most prominent and important authors of his day, Al-Jahiz remains widely read and respected for his literary skills. Now, although the Quranists are considered heterodox and so on the fringes of mainstream Islam, we find parallels to them in the other two great Abrahamic religions, namely Judaism and Christianity. Indeed, Quranism is similar to the Karaite movement in Judaism and, in Protestant Christianity, the sola scriptura, or scripture alone movement. Both Karaite Judaism and the sola scriptura movement reject oral tradition, as passed down through the generations of believers, as a valid source of revelation. Like Jewish Karaites and Protestant followers of sola scriptura, Muslim Quranists simply don't hold with hadith or other forms of widely held religious tradition. So, the hadith are accepted as articles of faith and wisdom by most Muslims, but rejected by some.